Okay, here we are back at capillary exchange. We spoke earlier about capillary exchange being the movement of substances in and out of the capillaries. We discussed diffusion and transcytosis, and I promised we'd come back to bulk flow after we had finished talking about distribution, and so here we are back at bulk flow. Bulk flow is basically filtration and reabsorption. It's the vast majority of what's going to happen at systemic capillaries and even pulmonary capillaries for that matter. We're going to move large amounts of dissolved and suspended materials in one direction. That direction is going to be dictated by pressure. We're going to move in response to pressure. This is most important for the regulation of the relative volumes of blood and interstitial fluid. We need to talk about these two definitions before we jump into the bulk of it, but really what we're talking about is regulating relative blood volumes and the volume of interstitial fluid. So filtration is going to be the movement of material from the capillary into the interstitial fluid. So we're going to move out of the vessel into the interstitial space, into that interstitial fluid. This process of filtration gets promoted by the hydrostatic pressure of the blood. And in part, well, actually equally so probably, by the interstitial osmotic pressure. So how much pressure do I have within the blood itself, and how much osmotic pressure, how much solids, what's the concentration of my solids in the interstitial space. The second half of this bulk flow equation is reabsorption. Because we've moved stuff out of the capillary, we also need to have a method for moving stuff back into the capillary. So reabsorption is that movement from the interstitial fluid back into the vessel. It gets promoted or driven essentially by the colloid osmotic pressure, so the solids within the bloodstream that are going to work to pull them back in. Filtration plus reabsorption, that's going to give me my net filtration pressure. How well am I filtering what's in the bloodstream? How well am I getting it out of the vessel into the interstitial space? And on the opposite end of the capillary, how well am I reabsorbing those wastes that I need to? Nice little visual that talks about the dynamics of capillary exchange. We're going to touch on Starling's law a little bit, but the long and the short of Starling's law is this. Let's make it very, very simple. The long and the short of Starling's law of capillaries is that reabsorption approximates filtration. So basically, how much you filter out should be roughly the same amount that you absorb in. So you're filtering out on the arterial end of a capillary, and you're reabsorbing back in on the venous side of the capillary. Any fluids, escaping fluids, plasma proteins that are lost, because remember we said this was an approximation, so about 85% of what's filtered out gets returned back, which means I've got about 15% that don't make it back in. So that escaping fluid and level of plasma proteins, those guys are actually going to get picked up by the lymphatic system and the lymphatic capillaries that are going to be in physically very close association to the blood capillary. Essentially, we're going to have about 3 liters a day that's going to get picked up by those lymphatic capillaries. All right, so what happens when filtration is greater than reabsorption? So what happens is this. It's called edema. It's that puffiness. I have more fluid in that interstitial space, right? Because I filtrated out, I pushed a whole bunch out of the arterial end of the capillary, and I didn't reabsorb in that 85%. Maybe I reabsorbed in 60% or 50% of what I filtered out. And that means I have this excess that's out here. And I have more than what the lymphatic capillaries can handle. And so what I end up with is this extra fluid in the interstitial space. that can happen for one of two reasons. It can happen because I have excess filtration, I'm pushing too much out, or I have inadequate reabsorption, I'm not pulling enough back into the vessel. So when we talk about excess filtration, we need to talk about, well, why? Why would that happen? We can see excess filtration as a result of increases in blood pressure. An increased or elevated blood pressure is hypertension. So I have more force pushing fluid and plasma proteins out of the arterial end, or perhaps I have an issue with the capillary permeability, so that I have an increase in the permeability of that capillary for some reason. Maybe I've damaged it, maybe it's just leakier in general, and what happens then is plasma proteins escape and they move into that interstitial fluid. Alternately, we can talk about inadequate reabsorption. So if I have decreased plasma proteins, in the bloodstream, I'm going to lower the blood colloid composition. I'm going to lower that colloid osmotic pressure, and there isn't as much impetus to drive liquid portion, the water portion, the fluid portion back into the vessel, into the capillary vessel. So edema is what happens when filtration is greater than reabsorption, no matter the reason. The interesting thing is that we don't really notice edema, at least clinically we don't notice edema until it's more than 30% above normal. So you have to have a pretty significant change in that filtration reabsorption before we're actually going to be able to notice it clinically. Hemodynamic overview, we'll do that really quickly, and that's probably where we'll end this video. But hemodynamic overview, so things that are going to affect blood pressure. In our last chapter, we talked about cardiac output, so make sure you go back and review that. Blood volume, if you have a decreased blood volume, I have less blood in the vessels, my blood pressure is going to be lower. If I have a whole lot of blood, if I have an excess blood volume, then I'm going to have an increased blood pressure. Viscosity, how thick is that blood? That will influence the blood pressure. The thicker the blood, the more viscous, the higher the pressure. The resistance. Do I have resistance in these vessels? Because if I do, you'll remember when we talked about stroke volumes and cardiac reserves and cardiac outputs, but what's going to happen is I'm going to increase that pressure as I increase the resistance within the vessels. And then arterial elasticity. As arteries lose their elasticity, as they become more rigid, then we're going to see an increase in blood pressure. Your definition for resistance is there. Resistance, remember, is in opposition to blood flow. It's the result of friction between the blood and the vessel walls for any reason at all. And that vascular resistance is really going to depend upon the three major factors: the vessel diameter, the viscosity of the blood, and the total length of the vessel. We can have factors that are going to influence the circulation. So pressure differences that are going to drive blood flow. So what's the velocity of the blood in general? Are we getting good velocity off of that left ventricle or not? What's the volume of the blood? And certainly blood pressure. Again, we're going to see resistance to flow, venous return, and we just have this interplay of all of these forces on these last two slides that really impact blood flow. So it's not, it can be a one-man show and we can have one issue that's driving a blood pressure change, or we can really have, and which is more likely, we're going to have a myriad of things that are playing together to create the situation we're dealing with. So next up, I believe we're just going to do an overflow chart of pressure, flow, and resistance, and we'll move on from there.